She stood on the marble, a folded blanket tucked under one arm and Arya pressed to her hip, and for a moment the city did what it always did. It looked away. The lobby around her moved in practiced indifference, suits passing like tides, the receptionist's gaze trained to the exact distance that kept empathy from slipping into workplace efficiency. Rain had made the marble shine slate gray, and the smell of hot coffee rose from a cluster of commuters who did not notice the thin resume that slid from Maya's hand and flattened against the cool stone. Arya was humming to herself, the small face turned up, waxy green crayon smudging across a sheet of paper in a way that was, to her, very important. Maya stooped, fingers fumbling, the leather of her bag slick with weather, and the world tightened around the barely audible sound of a name badge clinking against a lanyard. A man, mid-50s, coat buttoned against the rain, stood a short distance away, looking at his phone with the absolute stillness of someone used to waiting. For an instant, she believed, because she had rehearsed the lines so many times in her head, and because adrenaline makes the improbable feel inevitable, that he held a rideshare app open and was the driver who would take them to the interview. Are you my Uber?" she asked, the sentence half laugh, half plea, and the lobby registered the moment like a camera blinked and kept going. He smiled in a way that did not condescend, a brief tilt of recognition, and then a steadier expression. "No," he said, his voice quiet and not quite public. He reached for Maya's resume with the same careful motion with which one removes a child from a puddle. "But I can help you get inside." If the first paragraph belonged to a photograph, the second should be a stage direction. Pause, then the small, required invitation. If this has found you because you follow stories of quiet courage, stay a little while. If you like what you read, please like and subscribe for more stories about people turning the tide in workplaces. It helps other ears find these voices. She let him take the paper. His fingers were warm. He led them past the receptionist with a confidence that cleared the air, the way a hand clears steam from a mirror. Maya kept her voice low, answering the clerk's litany of questions about appointments and identification and permission to bring a child, the last being said as if children were hazards rather than human beings. The man, James as she would later learn, spoke once to the desk, a sentence long and casual that had the precise effect of a minor miracle. The receptionist looked up, blinked, and stepped aside. Maya felt the flood of relief whole and pure. She pressed Arya to her chest and realized she had been holding her breath. The man's coat shed a few drops of rain onto the marble, tiny dark freckles that evaporated as quickly as they appeared. He let them sit in a chair that faced the floor-to-ceiling windows. Through the glass, the street was a blur of umbrellas. Arya, unconcerned, handed Maya the crayon drawing, bold green lines that, to any adult, read like the map of a tiny mind discovering density and border for the first time. "For you," Arya announced solemnly. Maya smiled until it felt like a small uprising inside her chest. The man, who had stood there like a stranger, accepted the drawing with a seriousness that made Arya beam. "Thank you," he said. And for the first time since she had arrived, the lobby felt less like a test than a place where other people could also be human. Maya did not know then that the man had a title that translated to most people's idea of the top of the building. She did not know his name, except for the polite reply he'd offered when the receptionist asked who he was visiting. She did not know, in that moment, that he would later hang up his coat in an office with framed photographs of river bends and a carefully curated library. That he would stand in front of her in a boardroom and say, simply, "We need you," and mean it. She only knew the way his presence shortened the distance between being invisible and being seen, and how the small, shivering kindness of a stranger could reroute the trajectory of a day. The interview itself, later that morning, had an odd geometry: a conference room that absorbed sound, a round table with too many chairs, and the hum of the city's systems seeping in through the glass. Maya sat with her hands folded, Arya beside her coloring in a corner with crayons kept discreetly in a grocery bag, the folded blanket a small hill on the chair. She spoke plainly about her skills, logistics, communications, the volunteer work that looked like direction when framed as experience, and tried to breathe through the way the hiring panel's eyes slid past her, cataloging the thinness of her shoes and the small smudge on her sleeve like they were details that explained her personhood. That humiliation arrived not as a single blow, but as a weather. The receptionist's clipped smile, a whispered aside that could have been about schedule but felt like shorthand for otherness, the way a laptop screen angled to avoid her. It was all the more naked because the city had taught her to hide such wounds. James was not on the panel. He was in the doorway, watching through the glass, an observer whose presence felt at once eavesdropping and protection. When the interview ended and the panel left in their practiced procession, he stepped forward, introduced himself properly, James Whitmore, CEO, and told her that he had been impressed by the way she answered a question about crisis communication with a concrete plan that included timelines and quiet coordination. "We need people who can hold several things at once," he said, glancing at Arya as if to acknowledge the invisible arithmetic of Maya's life, "and people who are prepared to make the work safer for others who come after." Guia de estilo e instruções para a síntese de fala. Você é narrador, palestrante, com voz potente, forte e autoritária. O tom deve ser firme e inabalável. Contexto de continuidade. A frase anterior era "We look the work safer for others who come after." Você está no meio de uma frase ou pensamento. Mantenha o ritmo e a força vocal sem quebrar a conexão. Haja como se estivesse transmitindo uma verdade fundamental. It would have sounded like a pledge had it not been so immediately practical. He asked if she could start next week. Maya, who had rehearsed 1,000 fictional answers in the subway, found herself saying yes without the sediment of fear settling in. James did not make the offer grandiose, he made it precise. He sent a calendar invite before she left the building. Subject: Start date, Maya Williams, Communication Specialist. The invite had a meeting link labeled Onboarding Overview and a small attached PDF titled Welcome_Packet_JW_0419. When she checked her phone, the message from the company HR system read, "Interview outcome, offer extended." There was a short line at the bottom, "We look forward to your first day." Her first day was both a triumph and an exercise in becoming accustomed to the architecture of being new. Tamika found her at the elevator that morning, Tamika with a lunchbox and a laugh that seemed to know where to place itself. "You look like you survived a storm," Tamika said, and then, softer, "And you're here." Tamika had been at the company long enough to know the invisible lanes. Who to send an email to when a desk chair had to be replaced, who took the best care with travel reimbursements,
which managers were kind and which were polished with cruelty. She slid an envelope across the communal table during the orientation coffee. Lunch voucher, cafeteria, any day this week. Don't spend it all on the pastry. It was an allyship in paper form. But the corporate world had its own grain, and being given a place in it did not evaporate the tides of skepticism. The first weeks were a litany of microaggressions that accumulated like pockmarks. Someone rearranged her desk to put her farther from the team whiteboard. An internal chat thread circulated a GIF in response to one of her suggestions, the kind of dismissal that laughs instead of replying. She found a sticky note one morning on her monitor with a phrase that could have been friendly but arrived flat and edged. Nice try. The note's handwriting was anonymous. The adhesive left a pale rectangle on the monitor like an absence. Each incident, small as it was, sharpened the sensation that the company had places reserved for certain people, and other places that were held for those who made the effort to belong. Maya kept detailed notes. That was part habit, part superstition. She wrote down the time of each meeting, the subject lines of emails, the names of attendees, the precise wording of dismissive comments. She had learned from a life of precariousness that documentation was a kind of shelter. Fold it into the pocket of your day, and if the weather turned, you would have something to show for the fact that you'd been standing there at all. Her notes were not only for complaints, they were evidence that she was present. She saved email threads with subject lines like Re-Outreach Strategy Q3 and Feedback on Draft Internal Comms.
She photocopied the sticky notes and photographed them. File names STICK 2024-04-2701.jpg. In her desk drawer, she slid an extra USB drive, encrypted with a simple password she could remember, Arya 2019. It felt, at the time, like a small, necessary act of self-preservation. The real storm began when the memos started to come from nowhere and everywhere. Anonymous messages seeped into the Slack channels, snarky comments, a rumor-laden thread that suggested she had bypassed protocol to secure her role. Someone forwarded a text conversation to her in private, an image of her resume with a sarcastic annotation. The whispers, which had been a background noise, turned into little instruments of isolation. Her manager, Deborah Langston, who had the kind of competence that intimidated rather than inspired, called her into a meeting with HR. The room smelled faintly of lemon polish and a corporate kind of calm. Deborah's face was an architecture of restraint. "We want to make sure you're settling in," she said, and there was an edge to the sentence, a note of officialness that contained a power beyond the words. Maya left the meeting with a checklist and an HR email thread that read in the formal register of investigations, subject, Informal Concern, Maya Williams. There were required steps, a meeting to discuss team dynamics, a reminder about the company's code of conduct, a suggestion that she might find the New Hire Buddy program helpful. The tone implied concern and care, but also centralized responsibility on her to integrate. Tamika's response was immediate and unapologetic. She brought Maya a thermos of soup and sat on the bench outside the building while the rain cooled the pavement. "They're fishing," Tamika said, stirring steam with a spoon. "They're testing to see what you'll do when they're mean. It's how they keep people small." She passed Maya a post-it with 3 words, Document, Breathe, Allies.
"And smile," Tamika added, with a grin that did not reach her eyes, "but not at the cost of your dignity." The first concrete act of hostility arrived in a way that felt small and then bigger than small. A project file that had been assigned to Maya was quietly reassigned in a way that would undercut her metrics. The change was minor on the surface, another manager looping into the thread, but it was timed to coincide with a client meeting. Maya walked into the meeting with her notes and a plan, and watched the air rearrange itself as the other manager presented the idea as a tweak rather than a joint work. Afterward, Maya found herself in the stairwell, shoulders pressed against cold concrete, feeling the familiar attrition of confidence. She took out her notebook and wrote, in sharp, deliberate letters, what had happened. Stairwell, 2024-05-10. Project reassigned. Observed by team. The pattern was clear enough to frighten the system into being, but not clear enough to demand action. It felt like the company had a temperature that sometimes spiked and then cooled, as if disruptions were allowed to pass rather than being engaged with at their root. Maya began, quietly, to build a repository. She copied relevant email chains to an encrypted folder on her personal drive, drive/Maya/archive/emails/project reassign 0501.eml encrypted. She kept offline copies too, printed to PDF and saved to a flash drive that she hid in the lining of her tote. She told herself she was preparing for contingencies. She rarely recited aloud that she feared being written out of both job and dignity. The practice of saving files became a ritual, and in the small ritual she found a calm that resembled power. It was Tamika who planted the first insurgent seed. "You should do a series," she said one afternoon over cardboard cups of coffee. "Not complaints, stories. Let people talk." The idea landed with Maya like a stone thrown into still water, radiating possibilities. They called it Voices Within, in the joking way of people who name things before anyone else does to make them more real. The project, at first, was a modest, risky thing, to collect narratives about the company's culture, small acts of exclusion, instances where someone had been overlooked, artifacts of practice that revealed a pattern more than a single incident. Maya saw in it a way to use her skills, organizing interviews, creating safe prompts, preserving anonymity where needed, and a way to build pressure that felt ethical and evidentiary rather than accusatory. They worked in a borrowed corner of the cafeteria, laptops open, a cardboard sign with Voices Within taped to the table. Maya drafted an outreach email. Subject, Voices Within. Invitation to share your experience. Confidential. The form linked to a secure survey and offered options: anonymous submission, one-on-one recorded interview with pseudonym, or submission of artifacts, emails, sticky notes, exit interview summaries. To preserve safety, submissions were encrypted on reception. The email read in part, "We want to understand the experiences that shape our day-to-day here, not to shame, but to inform improvement." They circulated it through channels that Tamika knew: informal groups, a community of parents who had experienced gatekeeping, a listserv of people who had left teams quietly and still checked in. Responses came like slow, honest weather. People wrote about the friction at the edges, the way suggestions from junior staff were paraphrased as though they had been discovered by someone senior, the way the company's meritocratic language favored those who spoke in the approved cadence. Others sent PDFs from exit interviews. File, Exit Interview 2016 JK, with redactions and the telling lines left in plain text. One submission included an audio file recorded during a farewell gathering that captured a manager's offhand remark about who belonged at real meetings.
The spreadsheet read like the ledger of a small resistance. Many rows, careful entries, an insistence on accuracy that felt like prayer. It was also the moment when pressure increased. Anonymous messages turned into directed whispers. Someone left a folded note on Maya's desk. Careful who you trust. Her inbox picked up a thread. Subject: concern regarding unofficial initiative. HR scheduled an official meeting that was not pleasant in tone. Deborah was present. She opened the conversation with a measured voice, referencing policy and the need to avoid unauthorized use of company property. Her language was precise. Her eyes, Maya felt, were measuring how far she could push without causing a scene. "We appreciate initiative," Deborah said, "but there are proper channels for this work." When Maya explained the intent, listening, documenting, preparing a non-punitive presentation, Deborah's mouth tightened. "This is delicate," she said. "There are legal considerations." That phrase, legal considerations, has a way of compressing the human into the bureaucratic. Tamika, who had been in the corridor like a small warm shadow, squeezed Maya's hand and then left her with a practical note. "We keep the copies. We keep the logs. We don't spread anything unverified." That's not courage, it's sabotage. Maya nodded, the ledger of her life carrying another line. Rules for Voice Project. Verify, corroborate, preserve. The stakes rose when an audio clip appeared on an internal anonymous thread, accompanied by a screenshot that suggested the clip had come from a past meeting. The clip's provenance was murky at first, but when they cross-checked the voices against timestamps from calendar invites and matched room bookings, the outlines of an origin took shape. The manager whose tone was captured in the clip was, by multiple corroborating sources, the same person who had been described in exit interviews as cultivating a climate of fear. Deborah's name hovered near that center. The company that had once treated small indignities as unfortunate noise began to smell, for several people, like a long-buried problem being pried loose. Voices Within moved from a cafeteria table to a more formal plan. Maya prepared a framed strategy document. Project Plan, Voices Within, Phase 1, Listening and Documentation. She included deliverables, an anonymized report, recommendations for policy change, suggested metrics to measure cultural health. In the margins, she wrote notes about safety, encrypted submissions, witness corroboration, chain of custody protocols. She scheduled a proposal meeting with James, who listened to the plan in his office with a seriousness that made the afternoon feel like a hinge. "We can't pretend this doesn't exist," he said. "If your project can be the shape of how we change this place, then it is worth the risk." James agreed to sponsor the initiative publicly, but in doing so, he also warned that institutional change required accountability through the right channels. He asked for a phased approach. First, a listening phase with anonymized results. Then, a pilot internal communications campaign to surface values. Finally, if warranted, an independent review. He arranged for a legal check on the materials to ensure the company could act without exposing contributors to reprisal. In an email whose subject line read, Voices Within, Executive Sponsorship, he wrote a short line that Maya kept pinned to the inside cover of her notebook. "We will protect contributors and act on evidence."
That promise, a mixture of moral commitment and procedural precaution, felt like sunlight after a long rain. But it also introduced new dynamics. From the minute James's name appeared on the project, the institutional players rearranged themselves, and Deborah's posture stiffened in ways that suggested the battle would be less about truth than about who controlled the narrative. When Maya walked down the corridor, she felt the space divide. People who whispered, and others who watched the whispering with the same neutral expression they'd brought to the lobby. The sticky notes multiplied, some encouraging, some sharp with sarcasm. The first real public manifestation came in an internal newsletter titled Inside, Culture and Community. The piece was careful, a mosaic of anonymized quotes and aggregate data. 74% of respondents reported experiencing dismissal of ideas. 63% described a gap between stated values and day-to-day practice. The language was measured, but the numbers were a clear cut. It was hard to smear away. The newsletter included an announcement. Town Hall, Voices Within Findings to be presented. Invitation, all employees. Calendar invite attached. The town hall, scheduled for 3 weeks hence, felt like the first scene in a trial that would determine the company's trajectory. Maya rehearsed her remarks in the small, unlikely theater of her apartment while Arya slept, the green crayon drawing pinned to the fridge like a talisman. She wrote and rewrote a short segment. "We are not here to shame. We are here to name patterns so we can repair them." She practiced breathing, letting each sentence land with the clarity of someone who had been rehearsing for decades inside the small, unremarked rooms of survival. Tamika helped with the flow, cutting long clauses, sharpening a line about dignity into something that could be remembered. "You need moments people can repeat to themselves," Tamika said. "Give them a phrase they can take into the break room." News of the town hall spread through the company with the peculiar velocity of an event that would be both watershed and test. Meetings sprouted like small storms. Some managers sent calendar blocks labeled "Do Not Attend, Focus Time." Others sent terse notes reminding teams of decorum.
Deborah scheduled several pre-town hall briefings with HR, and Maya received an email titled Pre-Town Hall, Expectations and Boundaries. The email thanked her and the team for their work and reminded contributors to maintain professionalism and avoid personalized accusations. It was both necessary and obviously designed to limit the capacity of the meeting to name who had been harmed. Still, the town hall promised to be a public airing where anonymized testimonies would be presented and where a live Q&A would follow. James sat on the dais, his posture steady, the post-it "Listen" still stuck to his laptop monitor. He introduced the session with a short remark about accountability and the need for clear, tangible reforms. When Maya took the microphone, the room contracted to the size of her voice and the pull of what she represented. A mother who had been scolded silently by systems. A professional who kept ledgers of indignity because the ledger was a kind of care. She read, with careful steadiness, from the compiled anonymous submissions. The words were unadorned, small stories of being talked over, of being excluded from emails, of promises that never turned into action. Each story landed like a pebble thrown into a pond whose surface had been made still by long habituation. The sound of people inhaling echoed like rain on the roof. Near the end, a hand rose from the back. It was Deborah, who asked a question in the neutral language of policy. Then another voice, someone from a team that had been mentioned, spoke of a pattern that had been traced back to a leader's habits. The conversation shifted from anecdote to consequence. James listened, then turned to the room and said, "We will initiate an independent review and convene an ethics council."
The phrase ethics council felt to many like the beginning of repair. But promises must translate into structures. The Ethics Council was proposed as a permanent body, a committee with defined powers to receive complaints, to protect contributors, and to make policy recommendations to the board. The initial proposal included metrics for cultural health, timelines for investigations, and the appointment of an external reviewer. For many employees, it signaled that the company's intention to change was not simply rhetorical. For Deborah, it meant a recalibration of influence, the kind of power rearrangement that produces loyalties and resentments in roughly equal measure. After the town hall, the mood of the building shifted in small increments. Conversations that had been hushed now happened in open corridors. A board meeting was convened with an agenda item titled Organizational Culture and Accountability. Maya received a calendar invite that read, Board Presentation, Voices Within, Findings and Recommendations.
She prepared a deck, not because she wanted a performance, but because she had learned that data needed to be converted into changeable formats, charts, timelines, clearly attributed evidence. The deck included anonymized quotes, aggregated metrics, and a chain of custody appendix that documented where each artifact had come from and how it had been preserved. Appendix A, Document Provenance and Custody. It read like a meticulous sermon to an institution too often willing to prioritize appearances over repair. On the morning of the presentation, rain swept the city in a steady sheet that made the windows appear like ink. Maya stood before the board, the room's humidity clinging to the nape of her neck, the crayon drawing tucked into the pocket of her notebook like an oath. She spoke with measured cadence, each slide an argument, evidence, corroboration, recommendation. Her voice had acquired an unmistakable quality, the weight of someone who had been carrying more than herself for a long time and had finally found a place to set it down. When she finished, the room sat in a rare silence that suggested something like reckoning. Deborah spoke after her, with a tone that was more complicated than anger. She acknowledged structural gaps and spoke of the need for rigorous assessments. But between the lines of her language, there was a caution about the pace of change. The board, which had been watching like a weather system, asked for time to consider legal ramifications. James, who had sat quiet for most of the session, leaned forward and said plainly, "We cannot let time become an excuse for inaction." His words carried weight. They were not a demand, but a directive, grounded in the moral ledger of the company. The outcome was not instantaneous, but it was consequential. Langston would be asked to step back from day-to-day leadership pending an independent review. An ethics council would be formed with a chair appointed from outside the current power structures. And Maya was asked to work with James in the first phase of implementing feedback mechanisms, a role that translated eventually into a formal title and a seat at tables that had once been closed to her. That evening, when she returned to her apartment, Arya ran across the living room with the crayon drawing clutched in both hands. "You did it," Arya said, as if the logic of how adult change works were simple and absolute. Maya crouched and took the paper, tracing the green lines with a fingertip. Outside, the rain had cleared, and the city breathed with the washed clarity of a sky that has been scrubbed. The crayon's wax gleamed in the lamplight like a promise. Maya held Arya for a long time, feeling the small body settle against her, and thought of the ledger she'd kept,
The sticky notes, the encrypted files, the hours spent rendering memory into evidence. She had not fought for herself alone. She had been the conduit for many voices.
Keep building. Then she turned off the lamp and listened to Arya breathe, the sound steady and untroubled, a kind of promise that rooted whatever came next in the most important metric of all. Dawn found Maya at the kitchen table with her laptop closed and a mug gone cold. The document she had saved the night before sat like a compacted promise on the screen of her phone, a list of policies, timelines, names, deadlines. Rain had given way to a clear, honest light that seemed to insist on things being seen. For a long time, she simply watched Arya methodically color the same patch of lawn, turning the green into variations as if studying which shade might last. The morning moved fast. She dressed with the practical deliberateness of someone who had learned to plan for contingencies. A blazer with deep pockets, shoes that would not betray her on stairs, a small bag with Arya's snack, and a notebook with a penciled list of meeting points. She kissed Arya against the crown of the head and left a note on the fridge. "Coffee by the kettle? Call me if anything." Because even in the formation of new structures, the small exigencies of life required simple ceremonies. The sponsor from the lobby, whose proper name was Elias Moreau, was waiting in the conference room when she arrived. He had the air of someone used to making quiet, consequential adjustments to futures. A measured voice, a half-smile reserved for bad weather and bureaucratic inertia. He rose when she entered and offered his hand. "You did more than save documents," he said. "You put words in a row so people could follow them. That matters." Maya uncapped her notebook and slid the first section across the table. How we keep people safe. Elias read briefly, then folded the sheet and set it aside with a deliberateness that only slightly belied his impatience to move things forward. "We can pitch a pilot," he said. "Protected channels, yes, but we'll need an independent ombudsman, external counsel cleared for victim confidentiality, and a contingency fund for those who can't return to work immediately. We also need to get the board to commit to a public statement, one that doesn't read like a press release written by lawyers who prefer to hide behind clauses." The legal team was already circling like well-fed birds. They had drafted a cautious memo that tried to balance potential liability with a sanitized promise of change. Their first draft's preferred language, "matters under review, protocols being considered, no wrongdoing has been confirmed." The memo's caution, meant to defend the company from lawsuits and reputation risk, felt to Maya like a refusal to accept a moral ledger that had been opened. "You can't start with legalese," she said. "People here are scared. They need to know, really know, that we value their safety above our image. That means clear commitments, immediate protections, and a willingness to take painful steps." Elias nodded. "I'll take that to the chair." There was a burgeoning coalition of employees who were beginning to speak in public, and a handful of board members who finally, belatedly, understood that inaction would cost more than accountability. Maya had never wanted a public role. The ledger was never meant to be a career move. But the ledger had become a hinge on which other people's futures swung. So she found small ways to rest. A late Sunday morning when she let Arya watch cartoons while she slept an extra half hour. A run around the park that cleared static from her mind. A ritual of writing 3 small gratitudes before bed. In those pockets, she preserved the ability to hold other people's suffering without being consumed by it. The legal maneuvering continued. There were protective orders to negotiate, non-disclosure clauses to parse, and a long, wearying conversation about what to disclose publicly and what to keep confidential to protect survivors. PR wanted a tightly controlled narrative. Nora wanted transparent process. Maya argued for the survivor's agency at every table. For her, transparency was not about spectacle. It was about restoring power to those who had been disempowered. As the months progressed, a clearer shape of the future emerged. The Ethics Council was formalized, including rotating employee representatives and survivor advisors. The company committed to a budget for mandatory training and to an external audit of hiring and promotion patterns. A permanent ombudsman was appointed, someone with a reputation for integrity and an independence clause in her contract. There were apologies, some eloquent, some halting, but apologies without structural change began to feel performative. So Maya and the council hammered at the scaffolding until there were iron basics in place. Outside the boardroom fights and the council meetings, life continued with its ordinary insistence. Arya learned to ride a small bicycle without training wheels and found the dangerous joy of speed. Maya's evenings were still full of homework help and bedtime stories of a child's small hand finding hers in the dark. The ledger did not intrude into those moments. It lived in a drawer, opened when necessity demanded, and closed when it did not. That boundary mattered. Work that consumes all of a person leaves no room for repair. One day, months after the first entries had been made, Nora presented a preliminary report that made the room go quiet. It was not sensational, and it did not close every story. But it laid out a pattern, a series of decisions and omissions that collectively created a culture where transgression was more likely to be minimized than addressed. Nora recommended disciplinary measures for those whose conduct had been proven, structural changes that would remove lines of power that concentrate risk, and a reparative fund for survivors. The report also commended the courage of employees who had come forward. For the survivors who had feared saying their names aloud, Nora's words were a confirmation, a kind of official translation of what had been whispered. For those in power who still resisted, the report was an inconvenient lens. There were long conversations afterward about the legal implications, about the time it would take to act, about the costs. But the report had shifted the conversation from abstract possibility to a spelled-out map of remedies. In an unexpected move, the company's chair announced that she would not stand for re-election to her committee position at the next meeting. It was framed as a graceful exit to allow new leadership to take hold. The resignation, in practical terms, removed an obstacle to reform. In symbolic terms, it signaled that accountability had teeth. The board appointed interim leadership and opened the process for employee nominations to the Ethics Committee. Maya, who had not sought a title, found herself asked to join an advisory role, an offer she accepted with the caveat that she remain a conduit, not an arbiter, of survivors' needs. A season shifted. The rooftop garden that Arya had once pointed at in a drawing began to feel like a horizon. Plans were made for a community gathering, not a parade, but a measured recognition of those who had fought for change, those who had stood in the rain and retrieved resumes from marble lobbies, those who had kept records, and those who had listened. It would be small and intentional, a potluck, a short program, the unveiling of a small plaque that named the company's commitment to the values they were trying to build.
Maya thought about the plaque and wondered if words could hold the complexity of what had occurred. Perhaps they could not. But language mattered. Names mattered. The ledger, now catalogued and archived in an independent repository, had become both shield and testimony. It was not the end, it was a foundation. On the eve of the rooftop gathering, Maya walked up the stairs to the garden that had once been a line of empty chairs. Someone had already strung lights between the railings. They glowed like small constellations. Chairs were positioned in a loose semicircle. A few people sat in quiet clusters, smiling with the cautious happiness of people who had been through storms and now saw the first blue after the clouds. Arya ran ahead and threw herself into Maya's arms, hair damp from the fountain that stood at the garden's edge. "You're coming, right?" she said, as if the possibility could be bargained for. "I wouldn't miss it," Maya replied, "because leaving the room would feel like abandoning the work to a sunrise that had not yet happened." They sat together on a low wall while the last preparations were made. Elias found them and handed Maya a paper cup of something warm. His presence had become a steady current of support. The gathering the next day would be modest, a collection of voices rather than a spectacle. There would be no triumphant end, no final chapter to the ledger. But there would be names spoken aloud, acknowledgments made in public, and a structural promise that the company would no longer be a place where silence counted as policy. Maya tucked the crayon drawing into her bag, a private talisman that had come to represent the thing she was building beyond policy, a life for her child in which safety was not provisional. She had written their commitments into documents and argued them into being. She had watched the ledger move from private record to public instrument. Each item checked off a list felt less like a technical victory than a small justice being assembled. The city beyond the garden hummed in its ordinary ways. Someone clipped a string of lights more securely. A volunteer arranged chairs with a gentleness that felt almost reverent. Maya breathed in the late spring air and felt, uneasily, tenderly, that the ledger's entries were no longer only a record of harm. They were also a map for repair, a set of coordinates for a labor that would stretch for years. She did not imagine for a moment that the work would end that night. There would be legal wrangling to come, new recruits who would need orientation, survivors who would need long-term care. There would be cultural work, not merely policies, but the slow, mundane rituals of respect that make a workplace safe, regular check-ins, honest performance reviews, the practice of listening before defending. These were the small daily acts that sustain a promised future. As the garden filled and people began to speak, first with quiet gratitude, then with stories, the ledger rested in her bag, like a steady heartbeat. Maya listened. She spoke only when she had to, and then simply, naming the commitments, reminding those present that safety required vigilance and humility. She thanked the people who had told their stories, and she thanked those who had finally chosen to help. When the formal part of the evening ended, small groups lingered under the lights. Arya chased a moth. Someone brought out cookies. The plaque was placed against a low wall, its inscription short and practical. To those who spoke, for those who will be protected. The plaque did not try to contain the ledger's long narrative, nor could it. It was a small marker, a named promise. Maya sat with a cup of tea, watching employees who had once kept their heads down now speak to each other with a new candor. It was not triumphant. Too much had been lost for that. but it held an honest relief. She thought of the ledger, of the small, ordinary labor of keeping records, and she felt a quiet, steady gratitude for the stubbornness that had compelled her to write. When the last lights were dimmed and the rooftop chairs folded away, Maya carried Arya home. The city had the softened hush of a world that had worked through an unseasonable storm. Maya placed the crayon drawing back on the fridge, like a vow.